probably floating around that he doesn't even know of? Like, who? What? Wait, what? Like, he... Never mind.
Quadratic formula now.
Are you using the back of this as scratch paper?
Yeah. It's my card, too.
All right. So we just talked about solving quadratics using completing the square and the square root property. There are times where completing the square either will not work or becomes so complicated that it's just not worth all the work that you would do. And that is when you use something called the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is a way that you can take the numbers that are found in a quadratic and plug them into a formula, and it'll just tell you here's what the two answers are. Okay, so the quadratic formula is pretty simple. Here's what it looks like. Quadratic formula is x equals, and then it's a fraction, so we'll draw a little fraction line. On the top, negative b, and then here's the plus or minus we've been talking about, plus or minus. And then comes a square root. And inside the square root, b squared minus 4ac. And on the bottom, 2a. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty simple formula, I think. It just rolls right off the tongue. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a.
So could that have been used for the stuff we were doing?
Yes. The quadratic formula can be used to solve any quadratic period. Obviously, you can see why we learn other methods to solve quadratics besides the quadratic formula, because the quadratic formula is hefty. That is a tough, tough formula. There's a lot going on there. So the quadratic formula is probably not going to be your first method for solving these. Probably you're going to try factoring or completing the square or something like that. But the quadratic formula is the method you would learn if you're one of those people that is like, I don't need to know 6 different ways to do a problem. I want to know one way that I can use every time. That's the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is the one way that works every single time on every single problem. So if you're looking for that, the quadratic formula is your winner. So let me tell you how it works. First of all, in order for the quadratic formula to work, your quadratic, whatever it is, has to equal 0. Has to equal 0. If it doesn't, you make it equal 0. So this problem right here, 3x squared plus 16x plus 5, we could complete the square on this. We'd minus 5 on both sides, and then we'd divide by 3. And when you started to divide by 3 to complete the square, that's when you might think to yourself, I wonder if there's anything else I can do besides complete the square, because dividing these by 3 is unpleasant. So you might try to use the quadratic formula here just because completing the square is kind of nasty. So the quadratic formula, you can see all the variables are a's, b's, and c's. Where do all those come from? Well, they come from this form of the quadratic formula. Ax squared plus bx plus c. The a is the number in front of the x squared. The b is the number in front of the x, and the c is the constant tagging along on the end. So in this problem that I just wrote, a is the number in front of the x, so a is 3. B is the number in front of the x squared. I'm sorry, I said those backwards. 3 is in front of x squared. 16 is in front of x, that's our b, and then c is the constant tagging along on the end there. Okay. Now we're just going to write the quadratic formula, but replace the a's with 3, the b's with 16, and we're going to replace the c with the 5. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now that's the hard part, but it's not the short part. The hard part is getting everything plugged in correctly. now all it is arithmetic, right? There's no algebra involved. We're just doing the math, but it is pretty meaty. So I'm going to leave the negative 16 out in front alone for now. On the bottom, 2 times 3 is 6. We'll go ahead and do that real quick. Plus or minus, and then let's work on the square root. So we've got 16 squared, that's 256. Minus, and then we want to do 4 times 3 times 5. 60, good. Okay. 256 minus 60 is 196. Is 196 a perfect square? Yeah, 14. So x equals negative 16 plus or minus 14 over 6. Now, when you see the plus or minus, that means there's 2 answers to this question. One of the answers is negative 16 plus 14 divided by 6. And the other one is negative 16 minus 14 divided by 6. 2 answers, one with the plus sign, one with the minus. That makes sense? So let's do the first one. Negative 16 plus 14 is?
Negative 2.
And negative 2/6 reduces to? Negative 1/3. Let's do the other one. Negative 16 minus 14?
Negative 30.
Good. Divided by 6. There you go. So my 2 answers are negative 1/3 and negative 5.
I like this a lot better.
Yeah,
For
yeah.
now. For
Everybody,
now. For now.
everybody likes the first one. So you might even be able to see where the quadratic formula is going to start to get tricky. If you had to guess, what's the tricky part going to be? Getting it equal to 0 is usually not that bad. You just add or subtract whatever's on the right side till it equals 0.
The 2 answer part.
The 2 answer part can be tricky, and so can the square root. This time, the square root happened to come out to be a perfect number like that. What if it doesn't? What if the square root's not a perfect square? In fact, usually, the square root is not a perfect square. That happens most of the time.
So subtract 3.
Good. This one doesn't equal 0, so we got to subtract 3 first to make it equal 0. So 2x squared minus 4x minus 3 equals 0. Okay? Right. Completing the square is maybe an option here, but I have to divide 3 by 2. Not like the end of the world to do that. But let's go ahead and do the quadratic formula since that's what we're practicing. What will A be? 2. B is?
4.
Negative 4. Very good. And C is? Negative 3. Once you get all that done, you're home free. You just plug it into the formula. Plugging it into the formula is the part you're most likely to make a mistake on, I think. X equals negative B. So it's negative 4. Negative b, and b was already negative, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Once this is plugged in like that, it's arithmetic. Now, the arithmetic isn't always easy. This square root in particular is going to be kind of nasty. But once you get it plugged in, there's no more algebra involved. Just sweet, sweet arithmetic. So let's do it. Let's start off with this negative 4. Let's just make that a positive 4. And then on the bottom, 2 times 2, let's also make that a 4. And then let's work on the square root. Negative 4 squared.
Negative, is positive 16.
Positive 16. Negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16. Minus 4 times 2?
Negative 8.
8 times negative 3.
Positive 24.
Good, so plus 24. And 16 plus 24 is 40. So I'm going to do 4 plus or minus the square root of 40 over 4. Good. That seems great. Now, the square root of 40 is not a perfect square, but it could still be simplified. There's a perfect square hiding in there somewhere. What's the square root of 40? 2 root 10. So 4 plus or minus 2 root 10 over 4.
Rationalize.
I don't have to rationalize because the denominator isn't a square root. But there is actually some reducing that I can do here, believe it or not. Yeah, since there's a plus minus, I can only reduce if I can do it in both of these, and I can. 4 over 4 will reduce, and 2 over 4 will reduce. What will 4 over 4 reduce to? 1 plus or minus. What's 2 over 4? That's a half, so 1 root 10 over 2. This seems like a pretty good way to write the answer to me. You could also separate it 1 plus square root of 10 over 2 and 1 minus square root of 10 over 2. And you could also turn the 1 into something that had a denominator of 2 and put it back together into one fraction. But every time I do that, you guys shout and throw garbage at me, so we're not going to do it this time. I'm tired of the abuse. Okay, that doesn't seem bad. I think I could almost live with this. Well, I mean, it equals 0, so, you know, it's not a total loss. What do you want to do? Do you want to do ABC right now? Because when I think about finding ABC, I think about plugging fractions into a square root.
Okay, well then.
That makes me a little queasy. Is there a way I could get rid of the fractions first?
Multiply the common.
Uh-huh. What would that common denominator be?
8.
8 will work, but I can go smaller.
4.
4. 8's fine, but 4 will work. What if I multiplied everything in this problem by 4? What would I get? Well, 1/4 times 4 is 1. So 1m squared minus 4m plus, what's half of 4?
3.
And then on the end, 0 times 4 is 0, so it even still equals 0. That's nice. Now let's do ABC. Now that I don't have any fractions. What will A be?
1.
Oh, good. What about B? And C? There we go. So, quadratic formula. It's the quadratic formula. Sorry, I messed up a little bit there. Quadratic formula. And it's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. By the way, when you get home, highly recommend going onto like YouTube and searching for a quadratic formula song. There are quite a few of them on there, and every one is more delightful than the last. 10 out of 10, highly recommended. Okay, so negative 4 is 4. And on the bottom, 2 times 1 is 2. Let's do the square root here. 16 minus 4 times 1 times 2 is 8. There we go. So 16 minus 8 is 8. And square root of 8 can be simplified. 2 root 2. Good. And that can reduce because 4 can be divided by 2 and 2 can be divided by 2. So 4 divided by 2 is 2 plus or minus. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So 1 root 2. So far, so good? Yes? Sure. I'm looking for a yes or no, lady. What if your quadratic equation looks like a complete dumpster fire? What should you do? Hmm?
No solution.
No solution. The end. I mean, what's the obvious problem here? It doesn't equal 0. So let's fix that first. Let's add 3x squared to both sides. And add 3 to both sides. So that gives us 3x squared plus x plus 3 equals 0. So yeah, step 1 is make it equal 0. A quadratic formula doesn't work if it doesn't equal 0. Would have been okay for us to subtract x on both sides to make it equal 0. That would have been faster right now, but then I would have had to deal with a negative a, negative b, and negative c. So I'm willing to do a couple extra steps here at the beginning so that I don't have to deal with negatives later. Not that there's anything wrong with negatives. What are they? Good. A is 1. I'm sorry, A is 3. B is 1. C is 3. Good. All right, here we go. Quadratic formula. Negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac. Draw a line under it. 2a will surely fit. It's the quadratic formula. I'd be happy to make you guys a playlist if you want something to listen to next time you're at the gym. I don't play any instruments. It's all a cappella, but you can make it work. Do you see a problem with the square root here?
No.
No? Happy with that one? Yeah, it's going to be negative inside the square root. I'm going to have 1 squared, which is 1, minus some stuff. I'm going to have a negative inside the square root. What does that tell you about your answer? Other than that, it's going to be fun. It's going to have an I. Exactly right. It's going to be a complex number, also known as imaginary. We're going to use our imagination.
You can't make up the answer for which means imaginary number.
Yep.
Right?
4 times 3 times 3 is 36. And 2 times 3 is 6. So inside the square root, I got 1 minus 36, which is negative 35.
Great.
What a positive attitude you have. Negative 35, great! Terrific!
So 0 plus I.
Yeah, what is the square root of negative 35? Yeah, square root 35 can't really be simplified. So the best we can do is negative 1 plus or minus I root 35 over 6. That's a pretty good way to write it. If you were asked to put it in A plus BI form, which usually you are, that just means separate it so that the I comes second. This right here is A plus BI form. Usually when you have an imaginary number, that's how you write it, is with A plus BI form is just a super weird way of saying put the imaginary number on the end. Okay. So what I want you to notice about this problem is that you knew the answer was going to have an I in it even before we did any math, just by looking at the square root. What was inside the square root told you we were going to have an imaginary or a complex solution, right?
Negative.
Huh?
The negative symbol.
Huh?
Huh?
Are you correcting me or are you agreeing with me?
Didn't you ask us a question?
Did you ask a question?
Or you
No,
said
which is why it was weird that you just said negative.
Oh, I heard a question. What was in the square root?
Oh.
that made
you
us
think
know.
that it was going to be
What
I?
was in
So
the
I said
square
negative.
root that made us think it was going to be I? A freaking negative, man! So it turns out the square root gives us a lot of information. If the stuff in the square root is negative, that tells us we'll have a complex solution. If the stuff in the square root is positive, that tells us we're going to have a real number. If the stuff inside the square root is 0, what would that tell us? I mean, close. 0 in the square root gets rid of all the hard work. It's a solution, but it's only one solution because I have plus and minus 0. If you work out one where you're adding 0 and another one where you're subtracting 0, your answer is the same both times. So if the square root's a 0, you have one solution, as opposed to every other problem we've done where we've had 2 solutions. This is such an important idea that we even came up with a special name for it that you need to pronounce carefully. It's called the discriminant. The discriminant, not discriminate. Discriminate is what happens when I'm at a Wendy's drive-thru and they won't give me extra nugget sauce. That is discrimination. Just because I wrote one hot check there for $1.07, it's discrimination for them to not serve me nuggets. They'll be hearing from my attorney as soon as I find one to represent me. I'm coming to get you, Wendy's. So there are 3 possibilities. Well, first of all, let's talk about what the discriminant is. The discriminant is the b squared minus 4ac, the part that's inside the square root. Okay? So if the discriminant is positive, if b squared minus 4ac is a positive number, that tells me we will have 2 real solutions. We will have 2 numbers, and neither one of those numbers will have an I in it. Okay? If the discriminant is equal to 0, that's the one we just talked about, you have 1 real solution. And if the discriminant is negative, that means you will have 2 complex, non-real, or imaginary solutions. So before you even do any actual math here, if you just look at the discriminant, if you just look at the value inside the square root, that'll tell you what to expect. So when you look at it, you can say to yourself, oh man, I'm gonna get an I in my problem, or I'm not gonna get an I in my problem just by looking at it. I'm gonna have one answer. I'm gonna have two answers. The discriminant can tell you that. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a handful of quadratics here, and I don't want you to solve them. All I want you to tell me is, how many solutions will I have? Okay, so here's the first one. So to do the discriminant, I need A, B, and C to plug them in. So A is 1, B is, and C is, okay. So I'm going to plug those in. B squared minus 4AC. That's going to be 36 minus, what's 4 times 1 times 9? 36 minus 36 is 0. What does that tell me?
It's one real solution.
If the discriminant equals 0, I have one real solution.
So what if it starts off equaling 0?
What if it what?
Starts off equaling 0.
If it starts off equaling 0.
Yeah, like x squared minus 6x plus 9 equals 0.
Uh-huh.
Does that tell us anything?
No, all quadratics have to equal 0 before you can use the quadratic formula. We're talking just about the discriminant.
So you have to
The discriminant is the part that's in the square.
The discriminant's the part that's in the square root, the b squared minus 4ac. Okay, take a look at this one. What's A?
1,
B,
negative 3,
and C.
negative 1.
Okay, let's plug them in. B squared minus 4ac. So negative 3 squared is 9. Minus 4 times 1 times negative 1.
Positive 4.
Positive 4.
That's 13.
So the discriminant here is a positive number. Positive 13. If the discriminant is positive, 2 real solutions. Okay. What about this one? A is 2.
Negative 7.
B is negative 7.
Negative 4.
C is negative 4. So negative B, B squared minus 4AC so 49 minus 4 times 2 times negative 4.
Negative 8. 32.
Plus 32.
Plus 32.
So that's 81, which means 2 real solutions. You get the idea? So that discriminant, the square root, is a powerful thing. It gives us a lot of information. Okay, let's do a velocity problem.
Great.
Good. Positivity. I like it. Let's see how your science skills are. I don't see how they could be better than your math skills, but maybe. You seen this formula before?
Yeah, it's like a great fun fact.
Okay, that's a little bit negative, but sure. This is a formula for velocity, specifically how far something's moving. Generally, you use this when you throw something or shoot something. This right here, right, this is its velocity, how hard you throw the thing. This is its height above the ground when you throw it. So what is this? If I throw something up in the air, does it keep going forever? It comes back down? Why?
Gravity.
Because gravity. The minus 16t squared is the effective gravity. So this problem, what we're saying is, I'm standing on top of a 200-foot tall building, and I hurl a graphing calculator into the air at 12 feet per second. How long does it take for it to hit the ground? So if 200 represents the height, I'm standing on top of a 200-foot tall building. I want to know when the thing hits the ground. How high would it be when it hits the ground? How high off the ground is my calculator when it hits the ground? 200 is when I throw it. How high off the ground is it when it hits the ground?
Depends on how hard it bounced.
Fair.
How high is it when it hits the ground? What sense does that make? It hits the ground.
So how off the ground is it?
0.
0. So the question is, how long does it take for the height of my calculator that I hurled to be 0? It hits the ground. We assume that it does not bounce back up.
I was like, it doesn't have any height at all.
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't. So the equation then is negative 16t squared plus 12t plus 200 equals 0. Now, technically, this is a problem you could do by completing the square, but you would not enjoy it. You would have to subtract 200 on both sides and then divide everything by negative 16. If you want to do it that way, I will not stand in your way. Be my guest. I think I'm going to use the quadratic formula. What's A?
16.
Negative 16. B is,
12.
and C is,
200.
cool, here we go. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Before we do anything else, are we going to have 2 real solutions, 2 complex solutions, or 1 real solution? How do you know? Yeah, there's a positive number where? Right, the discriminant's positive inside the square root. 12 squared is 144, and I don't know what all this is when I multiply it together, but I know a negative times a negative is a positive. So I'm going to have 144 plus something. That's going to be a positive number. So I'm expecting 2 real solutions. Now I do have to do the math part. It's okay. Negative 12 plus or minus the square root of, that's 144. 4 times 16 is 64. And 64 times 200, 12,800. And on the bottom, negative 32. So I have negative 12 plus or minus the square root of 12,944 over negative 32. It is a big number. Real big. What's the square root of 12,944?
Jimmy Cricket.
4 root 809.
A big number as well.
That seems okay. I think I'm going to go ahead and reduce this, though. These can reduce because they're all evens, right? So that seems good. I think all of these can be divided by 4, can't they? That seems good. Okay. So I'm going to do my two answers as, I'm going to go ahead and divide them by 4 as I write them. So divided by 4, divided by 4, divided by 4. Oh, whoops. I just wanted to do plus on that one. My bad. And then over here, the same thing, only with minus. Now keep in mind, I'm talking about time here. One of these is not going to make sense for time. Which one of these two answers is not going to make sense?
Negative.
Okay. Which one of those is negative? Left or right?
Right.
Correct. The left one. Negative 3 plus the square root of 809 is a positive number. I don't know what it is, but it's positive on the top. And a positive divided by a negative is a negative. So this is going to give me some kind of negative amount. It doesn't make sense to have a negative amount for time. So I'm not even going to do that one. I'm going to do this one.
Because the negative times the negative.
Exactly right. So this, negative 3 minus the square root of 809 over negative 8, that is going to be positive. A negative, and then you minus some stuff, so even more negative. So negative on top, negative on bottom, the answer will be positive. If you type it into the calculator just like this, you get about 3.9 as a decimal. Why am I suddenly doing decimals? Well, because if I said how long is it going to take my calculator to hit the ground, and you said it's going to take negative 3 minus the square root of 809 over negative 8 seconds, you'd get hurled off the building next. How long is it going to take? A little bit less than 4 seconds.
So if you put that in the calculator just like that, it's going to be.
You'd have to do negative 3 minus the square root of 809 first and get an answer, and then divide by negative 8.
Okay.
A little bit less than 4 seconds.
Wow.
Yeah, wow indeed. Who's got questions?
So not doing the